All right, I got a cold right now. I had a cold for a few days, but hose be working, and I can't stop. We got a video we gotta do, and I gotta make it. So we're gonna be making Viking Blood mead today. Now I intend this to be a beginner's recipe. Okay, if you haven't made mead before or only made one or two, this is the video and the recipe for you. I am taking for granted that you know what mead is. Mead is basically honey plus water fermented. And fermentation or alcoholic fermentation happens when yeast consume sugar and then they produce alcohol as a result. They also produce CO2. Okay, those two things. You gotta account for both of those when you're making mead or wine or cider. So I'm taking that for granted, even though I just explained it. So in case you didn't know, now you do. We're making a fermented honey plus cherry juice plus yeast product. Now I have one major and important caveat. I'm not entirely sure that I know what Viking Blood mead is. Okay? No, I didn't just randomly throw this together and with a bare minimum of knowledge. I tried to Google this, Viking Blood mead. There is a paucity of online information about what the proper Viking Blood recipe is, where it comes from, its history. I don't know. It seems to be a term that's applied to a cherry-based mead. Some recipes call for hibiscus and hops. That's going to be primarily the mead that Dansk mead that's bottled in and made in Denmark. I've never worked with hops or hibiscus, so I didn't want to make a video based on something I'd never used before. So we are going to make a simple cherry mead today. And it's called Viking Blood. Why not? It's close enough. Did the Vikings really drink this? I don't know. Again, just the internet, it didn't give me the sources. Maybe somewhere out in the scholarly tomes, there's some information on this and it's yet to be made available to people like me. Either way, this is gonna be great, okay? For all of the items for which I could find links online in the recipe, and for all of the equipment that I'm using today, there are links in the description to all of them. It's laid out very systematically and carefully and easily. So if you want to make this recipe and get the stuff required to make it, it's all listed right there. First, a gallon of tart cherry juice. We're making a 1 gallon batch and we're not using water, so all the liquid has got to come from cherry juice. Now it's important you don't get black cherry juice and you especially don't get sweet cherry juice. You get tart cherry juice. Why? Because sweet cherries and sweet cherry juice fermented generally has an icky flavor. 3 pounds or 1 big bag of frozen cherries. Now this specific one is a blend of both tart cherries and sweet cherries, and I know what I just said, but I think given how much tart cherryness we have going into this recipe, it'll be fine getting some sweet cherries in there. It's not going to taste icky. But ideally, you go ahead and you get a whole bag of just tart cherries if you can find it. 2 pounds of clover honey. This part is a little bit important because honey comes in a wide variety of types. I picked a neutral honey flavor as opposed to like buckwheat honey, which is going to be far more like molasses, or orange blossom honey, which is more orangey. I just want honey. And you can get this kind of honey pretty easily at Walmart, at the grocery store. It's not hard to find. Get 2 pounds of it. That usually equates to one of those bigger bottles. 1/8 of a teaspoon of wine tannin. This is a powder you can buy on Amazon or a home brewing store. Tannin is that stuff, that compound in black tea that makes it bitter. If you ever bite into a wet black tea bag, it dries up all the saliva in your mouth and it's bitter. That is tannin in a large amount, but a little bit of tannin, as we are using today, rounds out the flavor profile and the mouthfeel of a wine or a mead. So we're adding it in there, and it's not complicated. It's not like we're chemical scientists over here. Just get the wine tannin, and we're gonna add it in. 3.8 grams of Go Firm. This is a yeast nutrient which we will be utilizing. It will ensure a healthy fermentation. If you don't know much about it or have never heard of it before, that's okay. I will explain all of it in the process section. But for now, get some Go Firm. 3.7 grams of Fermade O. This is also a yeast nutrient, which will be doing a slightly different thing than the first one. Don't worry, it's not as complicated as it sounds, and I'll break it all down. Finally, 3 grams of Premier Cuvier yeast. As you know by this point, yeast is absolutely essential for an alcoholic fermentation. And you can really use any kind of yeast you want. Bread yeast, Lalvin 71B, QA23, Premier Classic. The list goes on and on. But This is the yeast I picked because it's a champagne yeast. It's a very hardy yeast. You can screw up a few things here and there, and the fermentation still work out, basically. It's not a sensitive yeast. So for your first time going around, this one works. The essential first step is to sanitize everything. So there are multiple methods of sanitation. Everyone's got their little niche thing. Here's my method, and it works. Get 1/4 of an ounce of Star San sanitizer. Okay, this is an acid-based sanitizer solution, which you then mix in water and you dunk all your stuff in it, and it kills off all the germs and microorganisms. Okay, there's a link, as I said, in the description to this. So you get 1/4 of an ounce and you pour it into about a gallon or 2 of water. Okay, the exact ratio is 1/5 of an ounce per gallon of water. I have about 2 gallons here in this bucket. That's 1/4 of an ounce. You get the idea. And then you put all of your tools and your equipment in here, not the food stuff, but all the equipment. And you let it soak in there for at least 30 seconds. What I like to do is just put all of my stuff in there that can fit anyway. And then as I need it throughout the process of putting it together, I just grab it, rinse off a little bit, use it, put it back. Step 2. This is perhaps the most complicated of all the steps, but it really isn't. It is to prepare the yeast and yeast nutrient slurry. So you're going to get a little jar, put just an inch worth of water in there, and then set it onto your grams scale. Okay, you'll notice that the increments we're using on these things are like 3.5 grams and 4 grams and so on. To measure amounts of that small a quantity, you need a grams scale. There's a link for that in the description. You put your jar with your water onto the gram scale, zero it out, measure out 3.8 grams of Go Firm, and then measure out 3 grams of the yeast of the Premier Cuvier. Okay, now if you really don't want to do that, then you're going to use 1 teaspoon of Go Firm and 1 teaspoon of the yeast. I would prefer for you, for your own sake, just get the gram scale so you can be a little more precise. And then you put a lid on it and you shake it up thoroughly and put it off to the side. You leave it for at least 20 minutes. That allows the yeast to rehydrate and to consume or absorb anyway the nutrients from the Go Firm, because that's what the Go Firm does. It's crucial at that very beginning stages when your yeast are waking up and replicating and budding into a full colony before they've actually started the activity of fermenting. So once you have that slurry, put it off to the side and move on. Then you want to get a brewing bucket, okay? This is the most essential piece of equipment for this stage, because if you didn't have a bucket or a container for your mead, you'd have nothing, okay? So get a bucket. Some people, a lot of YouTubers, use what's called a glass carboy at this stage. It's definitely prettier to watch a fermentation where you can see through the glass, you see all the activity, and you're like, oh, it's pretty, but it's not nearly as practical. And I won't get into all of the fun little explanations as to why I prefer a bucket, but you can trust me. So get a brewing bucket, I'll link in the description, okay? And pour your gallon of juice into it. Of course, make sure you sanitize your bucket first. I don't think this step needs any more elaboration. You just pour it in. Then you weigh out 2 pounds of honey on a food scale, all right? Once again, it's a little more specialized piece of equipment, not quite as much as a gram scale, but get a food scale. You'll use it many, many times in your mead and winemaking adventures, and it's worth the investment. So you weigh out 2 pounds, okay? And then you pour those 2 pounds of honey right into the juice, and then you mix it up. Sometimes it's helpful to get a little spoon to scrape off the edges of the bowl that the honey's in, because it's really, really thick and sticky. You want to get all of the honey goodness. So pour it all in and stir it all up. You really need to stir a lot, okay? Honey is thick, it's viscous, and it takes some effort to stir it. So put in the elbow grease and make sure it's thoroughly dissolved. Now, this next step is kind of optional, but if you put in a little bit more effort, you'll learn a valuable tool in the winemaking process. Get a hydrometer and a graduated cylinder. The hydrometer is that tool that allows the winemaker to measure how much sugar is in the initial juice before they ferment it. If you can measure that amount, and then in 3 weeks when the fermentation is done, you measure how much sugar is in there, the difference between those two measurements can tell you the alcohol content of your wine or your mead, because alcohol is just the conversion of that sugar, right? It doesn't come from anywhere else but the sugar. So if you know how much sugar was eaten up by the yeast, you know through an equation how much alcohol there is. So I am taking here what is called an initial gravity reading. This tells me how much sugar's in there. I'm aiming for 1.100, and that's what I got. Now, what matters most to understanding how to read a hydrometer is that if you plop a hydrometer just into water, it levels out at 1.000. If you add in some sugar, then the hydrometer begins to float higher and higher. Now, why is that? Because as the liquid becomes denser and denser, it exerts more and more pressure on the hydrometer, thereby forcing it up, pushing it up more and more and more, right? So if you have a calibrated scale that's standardized and set in place, you can measure how much sugar is in solution in the water. Now, of course, if you mix other stuff in there, you'll get a reading of the density of that stuff, but we're just assuming you have water and sugar, okay? You need the graduated cylinder because you need something to put the liquid into to make it float. And then I like to get a turkey baster to transfer said liquid into the graduated cylinder. As I said, this step is kind of optional because it's more just for your information and knowledge. I know this recipe works and I know what the corresponding ABV is. But if you didn't know what the ABV would be if you had 2 pounds of honey, for example, you would need the hydrometer to measure it. And eventually, if you continue in this hobby, you'll want to know this stuff. So that's a very rough and ready explanation. If you want more details, there are lots of good videos on YouTube to watch that explain the hydrometer. I will soon have a detailed video just like those other people, but I don't right now. So there's the rough and ready explanation. For more info, YouTube it. Okay, next you will get a brewing bag. This is just a nylon mesh bag that you're gonna put all of the fruit into, okay? Essentially the bag allows you to squeeze all that fruit and mash it up, thereby releasing the juice and letting the juice out, but it doesn't let out any of that pulp and the fruit stuff, so that later on in this process, when the fermentation is done, you can just grab the bag and take it all out and reduce the amount of time it takes to have everything settle out and clarify. It's just an easier step to take. You don't have to. You could pour the fruit directly into the juice, but this is how I like to do it. So you just trim the bag around the edges of the bowl and then pour in the fruit, okay? And then tie off the bag, because if you squeeze the bag without tying it off, it'll all just seep out. So tie it off. And then mash the bag up, just like a winemaker. Don't use your feet like you think you're supposed to do with grapes. That's an old technique. Don't do that. Just mash it up with your hands. Then, if it's been about 20 minutes, take your yeast slurry, open it, and pour it right in. If you did not do that step, you would just have honey cherry water. That's it. And it would eventually go bad. We want something much, much better, so we need that yeast. Pour it in. All right, we're getting close. We're getting close to the end. So if you've stuck out this long, great. Good for you. Good for me that I'm entertaining enough. We're almost there. Then you want to add your wine tannin, okay? It's 1/8 of a teaspoon. If you don't have 1/8 of a teaspoon, buy one. Let's do it. And then toss it in. So now all of this stuff is basically together. It's done. So get your lid to the bucket, press it down real hard, make sure it's actually on there, attached. And finally, this is the final step, get an airlock, okay? This is that S-shaped device that you're going to fill halfway with sanitizer water, just dunking it into the sanitizer and let it fill slightly. This allows the CO2 gas that is produced by your yeast to escape out through the airlock, just bubbles out, without letting anything in, like oxygen, like bacteria, or like bugs. A lot of times my airlock will catch fruit flies. You don't want fruit flies in your meat. So you have to have an airlock that both lets out the pressure from the CO2 and doesn't let any bugs in. And that's the really crucial point. If you didn't have an airlock and you just had a solid lid on top of an active fermentation, the whole thing would explode within a day. Just boom! Because CO2 adds pressure as it's produced, and more is produced, and it just keeps going, and then boom. Don't do that to yourself or to anyone else. It's dangerous. So get the airlock. This is essential. It's very, very, very essential. Then, and finally, place your fermentation, your bucket, into a cool, dark place. I keep mine under my desk. It doesn't have to be like super dark out of any sunlight or light. You just want it to be cool. You want it to be unexposed to changes in temperature. So about 60 to 70 degrees where it's relatively stable. That will allow the yeast to be happy and to not produce any yucky off flavors. Now, so with that all wrapped up and put together, what can you expect over the course of this fermentation? The first one is perhaps the most obvious, signs of fermentation. You should expect to see bubbling in the airlock. Bloop, bloop, bloop. If you don't see that after 2 or 3 days, it means the yeast you put in there are dead. So you got to put more yeast. Usually that doesn't happen if you have a brand new packet you opened up. So you should see signs of fermentation. And if you don't, it means something's gone horribly wrong. Number 2, you're gonna have to open this up and punch down that bag of fruit that floats to the top each day, okay? You do this to make sure that the fruit stays wet, because if it dries out at the top, there's a slight risk of mold, so you wanna push it down into the liquid every day to frustrate mold growing bacteria. You also want to ensure maximum flavor extraction, so you just keep the fruit mixed in there as often as you can. Thirdly and finally, you may have realized I have yet to mention that ferment. That's because it comes into play after. It comes into play after you put everything together. One day after your fermentation has started, and on day 2, 3, and 4, you add 0.9 grams of Go Firm into your must. Must is the word for a mead or a wine before it's actually fermented. So you add a little bit, about 1 gram of ferment into your must on day 1, 2, and 3, and 4 following your fermentation. The ferment supplies essential nutrients to your yeast as they ferment to give your mead the best shot of turning out super tasty and super good. If you avoided this step entirely, you would get a mead most likely. It would ferment out completely. You'd have, say, 13% alcohol, and it would work out. But it wouldn't taste nearly as good as it could have if you had supplied your yeast with nutrients. Happy yeast make yummy mead. So go with this step. The way I like to do it is you get that little jar from earlier, put a little bit of water, weigh out about 1 gram of ferment, and shake it up. That makes it a liquid, obviously, and just allows it for easier distribution into your mead. So you just open it up, pour it in, and you do that 4 times over 4 days. It's a little complicated, but it's actually pretty easy. Once you do it once, you're like, okay, I can do this. So, and I believe in you. I believe in you. You can do this. If you do all of those things, you will craft a delicious mead. Now, obviously, there's more to this story. You don't just go into your bucket with a glass at the end of this and drink it. Okay, we want to clarify it. We may want to add a few other things, and we want to bottle it. But I will teach all of you those things. No, wait, I mixed that up. I will teach all of those things to you in part 2 to this video. So this is a video that covers what's called primary fermentation, the production of all the alcohol. Then comes aging or secondary fermentation. Okay, and I will show all of that stuff to you in video 2. So I hope this was helpful. I hope this is inspiring you to get into the mead and winemaking hobby. It's a lot of fun. And leave comments, ask questions. I'm very receptive, and I like to think I'm pretty helpful. So check out other videos I have as well. They're not all as comprehensive as this one, but once you get the basic principles, you'll be able to follow along in those ones too. In the meantime, though, take care and have a wonderful